15:55, Claude respondeu. The sound of bone meeting ground at velocity is not the sound that movies use for it. The sound of bone meeting ground at velocity is not the sound that movies use for it. Movies use something sharp, something that communicates impact through its brevity. The actual sound, the sound that a human skeleton makes when it decelerates from flight speed into African soil, is denser than that, more final. It is a sound that the body registers differently from sounds that come from outside it, that travels through the jaw and the spine and arrives in the brain as information about structural failure, rather than as something heard in the conventional sense. And then the plane stopped, and the dust came in through every gap in the fuselage, and the silence was the silence of a machine that had finished doing the thing machines do when they fall, and was now simply a shape on the Kalahari floor. He tried to move his legs. They did not respond the way legs respond. They responded the way legs respond when the architecture that makes response possible has been fundamentally altered. When the ankles that should be the hinge between intent and movement have been compressed by several hundred kilograms of impact force into configurations that ankles do not have when they are functioning. The bone was not where bone is supposed to be. He knew this not only from the pain, which was comprehensive, but from looking, which he did because not looking felt more dangerous than looking, and the information that looking provided, however terrible, was information he needed. He was on the ground. He could not stand. The savanna around him was the Kalahari in full-day heat, and the full-day heat of the Kalahari is not a background condition. It is a presence, something that presses against exposed skin with the specific intention of removing moisture from it until the moisture is gone, until the systems that depend on moisture begin to fail in sequence. This is The Human Limit. I am your host. If you want to understand what happens when a human being becomes immobile in an ecosystem designed to consume immobile things, subscribe to this channel right now and hit the like button. Because what I am going to describe is 5 days on the floor of the African savanna with compound ankle fractures, no water, and the specific psychological torture of being the only animal in the food chain that cannot move away from the thing that wants to eat it. His name was Greg. He was a pilot and a conservationist, which means he knew the Kalahari not as a tourist knows it, but as a person who had spent years learning how its systems worked, who understood the relationship between species and resource and opportunity that governs every interaction in an ecosystem built around scarcity. He knew what the smell of blood carried in warm wind meant in the Kalahari at night. He knew what would come toward that smell, and he knew how quickly it would come, and he knew what it would do when it arrived. He knew this before the sun went down on the first day. The aircraft had gone down in the late afternoon. The mechanics of what failed and why are a matter of record that I am not going to dwell on, because the mechanics are not the story. The story is what happens after the plane has stopped moving, and the dust has settled, and the man who was flying it has done his assessment of his own body, and understood the situation with the specific clarity that acute pain sometimes produces, stripping away everything that is not immediately relevant, and leaving only the operational facts. Operational facts. Both ankles severely fractured, bone exposed through the skin on the right side, unable to bear weight, unable to walk, unable to move more than a few feet using his hands and arms across the hard ground. Water from the aircraft. A small amount, not enough. Radio. Damaged, but he transmitted and was not certain whether the transmission was received. Location. Remote. The kind of remote that the Kalahari produces, which is not just distance from assistance, but a specific quality of isolation in which the landscape itself provides no reference points, no structures, no evidence of anything human. He pulled himself back into what remained of the fuselage because the fuselage was structure, and structure in an open landscape is the difference between having walls and not having walls, and having walls mattered for reasons that would become critical in a few hours. The temperature dropped when the sun went down. The Kalahari has a diurnal temperature range that people who have not experienced it find difficult to credit. The same ground that reaches 50 degrees Celsius at midday can drop to near freezing in the hours before dawn. He was already dehydrated, and dehydration compromises thermoregulation, and the combination produced a physical state that was deteriorating on multiple vectors simultaneously. The heat during the day taking what the cold of the night had not yet finished taking. But the cold was not what announced the first night. The sound was what announced it. Not the sound of a specific animal, not immediately. First, the ambient shift, the specific change in the acoustic character of the savanna that happens when diurnal species reduce their activity and nocturnal species begin theirs. A change that anyone who has spent time in the African bush can identify, but that Greg was hearing now from the inside of a wrecked aircraft on the ground, rather than from a vehicle or a camp structure, and the difference in that positioning was total. Then, perhaps an hour after dark, a sound at approximately 10 meters. Not movement, not breath. The specific quality of attention that a large animal produces when it is locating something, orienting toward it, calculating. He knew what it was by the sound of it. Hyenas are not the animals that popular culture has made them. They are not primarily scavengers, a misconception that understates their capacity as hunters. They are highly intelligent, cooperative, and possess the strongest jaws relative to body weight of any land predator, strong enough to consume bone, which is relevant information for a man with exposed bone on the floor of their territory. They are also patient. Patience is the attribute that Greg would come to know most intimately over the following nights. The specific patience of an animal that has identified a food source and is willing to wait for the food source to become accessible. The food source was him. He found the piece of metal, a section of the fuselage that the impact had bent and partially freed, long enough to grip, irregular enough that striking it against the remaining structure produced a sound that carried, that bounced off the aircraft and projected outward into the darkness. He struck it. The sound went out, and the sound at 10 meters paused, and then the sound at 10 meters moved back. Not far. Moved back to 15 meters perhaps, and waited. This is the pattern that would define the nights. Strike the metal, produce the noise, cause the temporary withdrawal. Wait for the silence to extend far enough to suggest the withdrawal was more than temporary. Begin to feel the specific weight of exhaustion that the body accumulates when it has been in pain and without water and in heat for hours, and the weight became heavy enough to produce the beginning of the surrender to sleep. And then hear the sound again, closer, and strike the metal again. If the feeling of being hunted in the pitch black while completely paralyzed is already suffocating you, leave a like and subscribe to The Human Limit so we can continue pushing the boundaries of human endurance. Because the first night was only the beginning of what 5 nights without sleep, next to the smell of your own blood in predator territory, does to the architecture of a human mind. The hands began to bleed somewhere in the second night from the striking. The edge of the metal where he gripped it was not a surface designed for sustained contact with human skin, and the skin of the hand breaks down under sustained contact with irregular metal edges, and the breaking down produced bleeding, and the bleeding produced the specific additional concern that fresh blood from a new source was entering the air around the aircraft. He wrapped his hands in what he could find and kept striking. The microsleep episodes began, as they do, without announcement. Not a decision to sleep, not a moment of voluntary surrender. The brain taking what it needed in 5-second intervals that the body did not consent to. He would be awake, and then he would be not quite awake, and the sounds at the perimeter would change quality during those intervals in the way that sounds change quality when the processing center that interprets them is running at reduced capacity. He learned to recognize the change in sound quality as a warning, the shift from the hyena sounds as external facts to the hyena sounds as something processed differently, something that the reduced brain was incorporating into content rather than responding to as threat. He learned to use that shift as the signal to strike the metal before the microsleep completed, to interrupt the cycle before the sounds moved from the perimeter to wherever the reduced processing placed them. The hallucinations came on the third night. Not visual hallucinations, or not primarily, auditory. The laughter of hyenas is a sound that, under normal circumstances, the brain interprets as animal vocalization. Under the circumstances of his third night, with the dehydration at a level that affects cognitive processing, and the sleep deprivation at a level that produces the breakdown of the distinction between dreaming and waking, the brain stopped interpreting the laughter as animal vocalization. It interpreted it as voices, specific voices, people he knew, not speaking words he could reconstruct later, but producing the specific quality of familiar human vocalization that the brain recognizes below the level of language, a recognition that pulled at something deeper than the operational survival processing that had been governing his behavior and threatened to pull it away from the operational towards something that was not useful. He recognized this for what it was. This is the detail that I find most remarkable in the account. More remarkable than the physical endurance, more remarkable than the decision to keep striking the metal when his hands were bleeding and his body was failing. He recognized that his own mind was producing content designed to undermine the behavior that was keeping him alive, and he treated that recognition as information and used it operationally. He increased the rate of striking when the voices intensified. He used the intensification of the internal hallucination as the signal to increase the external noise. He turned the symptom into a tool. The fourth day brought what he described later as the clearest thinking of the entire period, which is counterintuitive until you understand that certain stages of dehydration and sleep deprivation produce brief windows of atypical clarity before the next deterioration, the brain gathering itself before further descent. He used this window to inventory what he had done and what he had not done, and to construct the most deliberate version of his plan for the fourth night. The plan was the same as the plan for the previous nights. The metal, the striking, the monitoring of the perimeter. He had no new resources and no new options. What he had was the information that he had survived 3 nights, and that 3 nights was 3 nights closer to the possibility that his transmission had been received and that someone was looking. Someone was looking. The search team that found him on the 5th day had been operating from the last known position of his flight plan, covering expanding sectors of the Kalahari in the aircraft that wilderness search in this terrain requires. They found the wreckage by visual, the disturbance on the ground that an aircraft impact creates visible from the air. What they found on the ground was not what they had expected to find, which is a statement that carries specific weight given that what search teams in this context usually expect to find when 5 days have passed without contact. They found a man, severely dehydrated, approaching renal failure from the dehydration, both ankles requiring immediate surgical intervention, hands wrapped in material that had soaked through with blood. Alive, conscious, capable of providing a coherent account of what had happened. They also found the tracks. The sand around the aircraft was a record of 5 nights of activity that the rescuers described later as one of the more extraordinary things they had seen, which in the context of people who conduct wilderness search and rescue in the Kalahari is a statement that means something. Hundreds of individual predator tracks in concentric patterns around the wreckage, the evidence of sustained interest by multiple animals over multiple nights. The tracks came close. In some places they came very close. In some places they came close enough that the rescuers could identify the point at which the track stopped and turned back, and could identify it as the point just within range of the sound that a piece of metal makes against an aluminum fuselage. The sound had held the perimeter. Not forever, not if the striking had stopped. The tracks told that story too, told it in the way that the absence of certain tracks in certain positions told it. The absence that meant the animals had calculated the situation correctly, had understood that the noise was produced by something that could produce noise, and that something that could produce noise had not yet reached the threshold of accessibility that would override the calculation. He had not reached that threshold. He was evacuated by air. The ankle surgeries were extensive. The recovery took months. He returned to conservation work in the Kalahari because the Kalahari was what he was, and because the things that tried to eat him for 5 nights were the same things he had spent his professional life trying to protect. And that fact was not uncomplicated, but it was the fact. He has described the nights in the terms available to him, which are the terms of a person who was fully present for something that most people will not be present for, and who knows that the terms available to him are not fully adequate to what he is describing. He says the hardest thing was not the pain and not the thirst. He says the hardest thing was maintaining the distinction, through the voices and the exhaustion and the hallucinations, between the interpretation of the hyena sounds as threat requiring response, and the interpretation of the hyena sounds as something his deteriorating mind was incorporating into content. He says that distinction is why he is alive. That is the human limit. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment. Tell me how many nights you think you could have maintained that distinction. At what point you think the voices would have become more convincing than the threat. At what point the weight of the metal against bleeding hands would have become too heavy to lift one more time. I read every single comment. I will be back with another story from the place where the difference between a living person and a dead one is a piece of bent metal and the willingness to keep striking it in the dark. The Kalahari is still there. The tracks have been covered by wind and new sand, the way the desert covers evidence of everything that happens in it, without preference or record. The aircraft wreckage was recovered. The perimeter it held for 5 nights exists now only in the account and in the memory of the people who saw the tracks and understood what the tracks were counting. What remains is the sound, the specific sound of metal against aluminum in the African dark. The sound that meant something was still there and was still capable of saying so.